Go ahead, Ahmed.
Thank you, Dr. Rabab, Sam, Cinque, and to all the co-organizers and co-sponsors of the event. I've really enjoyed learning already, and we just started. And so I love when I can come into a space and feel like I can impart something upon those attending, but I can also learn, and that is the type of space that you all have put together today. So thank you. My name is Ahmad Abuznaid. I was born in East Jerusalem, Palestine, and I had the opportunity to live in East Jerusalem as well as in Al Khalil, aka Hebron. And obviously that experience of growing up under occupation left an impact on me. A couple of the main unfortunate memories that I hold from childhood are the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre, when a settler from Brooklyn, New York, opened fire in the mosque in the opening morning prayers during the holy month of Ramadan, killing 30 Palestinians and injuring over 100. I think that, in addition to the checkpoints and the strip searches and the heavily armed forces of the occupation being around at every turning point, definitely leaves a lasting impact on a child. I moved back to the US at age 12 and began to have a deeper sense of the inequalities, the injustices, and the systemic abuses that we witness in the United States. It was very clear to me that Black Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, many different communities had different struggles that the U.S. had levied upon them. And of course, our indigenous Native American siblings who experienced, of course, a fate very similar to what we've experienced as Palestinians. And so I began to see these things, and I began to assess that the U.S. history they were teaching us in schools just wasn't really adding up. And so fast forward a bit to college, there was a young boy named Martin Lee Anderson who was killed in a juvenile boot camp in Bay County, Florida, about 2 hours away from where I went to school at Florida State University. And they attempted to cover up the death of Martin Lee Anderson, alleging that he died due to complications from sickle cell anemia. But of course, there was some truth that came out about the cover up, and we witnessed a video of guards beating young Martin Lee Anderson to death. We took action, and it was the first time, for me in my life that I was driven to civil disobedience and direct action when myself and 30 other students occupied the governor's office of then Governor Jeb Bush. And we demanded several things be accomplished before we would be willing to leave. And, some of those demands were accomplished, and others, of course, we did not accomplish. For instance, we shut down all of those boot camps in the state of Florida, all of those juvenile boot camps. Governor Jeb Bush had to meet with the family. He arrested many of those involved and charged them. Now, of course, those folks were not found guilty. Of course, the system went from juvenile boot camps to now private residential facilities, aka private prisons. And so we learned some lessons back in those days about how the system will reinvent itself to continue to oppress. A few years later, young Trayvon Martin was killed. And many of my comrades that I organized with in college made the call that we reunite. And that's when we founded the Dream Defenders, and we marched from Bethune-Cookman, a historically Black college and university in Daytona, Florida. We marched to Sanford, Florida, where young Trayvon Martin was gunned down. And on that march, where we marched for 40 miles and over 3 days, I was wearing a keffiyeh. And the keffiyeh has obviously been such a powerful, how do I say, proponent, but also subject matter that we identify with, the Palestinian resistance. And so people would ask me questions, what does the scarf mean? And we started to have conversations about state-sanctioned violence, about oppression, about apartheid, about colonialism. And we started to lay the groundwork on that very first march for the delegations that we would lead at the Dream Defenders. And basically our goal with the Dream Defenders leading those delegations was that we wanted to re-engage the Black radical tradition from the Dream Defender standpoint. We wanted to re-engage the Black radical traditions solidarity, historic solidarity with the Palestinian cause and Palestinian liberation. And so we started taking delegates from all over the US, from Movement for Black Lives, from the Gathering for Justice, from the Women's March, from Ferguson, to Palestine, so that they could meet with our counterparts on the ground over there, people dedicating their daily lives on the ground in Palestine to struggle and liberation, would have the opportunity to sit down with those doing the exact same thing here in the US. And I think the takeaway for me has been that so many of the folks in this generation unfortunately think that Dream Defenders and Black Lives Matter were a part of a beginning of a trajectory. And so that's why I get so excited about these conversations where we can talk about these historic connections, the historic legacy of our shared solidarity, and one day our shared liberation. So I just wanted to get you started briefly with understanding a bit how I came into this work and how Dream Defenders delegations have become a part of this rich tradition. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Rabab or Sam to hand it over to our next speaker. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Ahmad. We're going to hear from Brother Abdul Kalimat, who is a longtime revolutionary activist, scholar, good organizer, based in the Chicagoland area. I believe he's still there, right? Still in the Chicagoland area. Brother Abdul Kalimat is one of the founders of the African Liberation Support Committee, among many other organizations, both in academia as well as in the community. And we'll hear from Brother Abdul Kalimat, and then Brother Bill Sales will follow. You're going to unmute? Bottom left?
Yes. Thank you, Sam. First of all, let me express my appreciation for being involved in this program. The program that we're having today is part of a new development enabling us using cyberspace to have global conversations. So I'm very pleased that we not only have people in the United States, but people who are outside, especially people in Palestine. Welcome to this discussion. I've been an activist, as Sam said, in the Black Liberation Movement and in what we call Black Studies for almost 50 years. I want to just make a couple of points about what happened 50 years ago. Well, first of all, central to our intellectual and political development in this country, particularly African Americans, but really the movement more generally, is the figure of Malcolm X. Who enabled us to move beyond the civil rights movement, beyond the demand for inclusion into the United States mainstream society, to the concept of Black liberation that not only represented the fundamental demand for freedom for African Americans, but it also represented a critique and a fundamental challenge to the nature of the American society in general and its policies throughout the world. Malcolm wrote a very important essay. We will get back to discussing Malcolm in more detail later, but he wrote a very important essay in 1964 called Zionist Logic. Well, this is an important way in which he critiqued Zionism as a fundamental global policy of repression, and it represents a very important aspect of his thinking. Malcolm was assassinated the next year. Following that, in 1966, we developed the concept of Black Power. Black Power really was the popular slogan in the social movements of the African American people, following on Malcolm's lead. So Black Power became the important way in which the African American community began to talk about self-determination and national liberation. This, of course, enabled us to then connect immediately with the African liberation struggles, so that by 1972, the formation of the African Liberation Day Coordinating Committee initiated a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C. and in San Francisco and a couple of other places to support African liberation. And after that one demonstration, the African Liberation Support Committee was founded. So the African Liberation Support Committee was an important initiative because it enabled us to move from a critique of racism to a critique of imperialism. And this led us to understand national oppression, not just in Southern Africa and not just in the United States, but in Palestine as well. So that in my own case, by 1975, I was director of the African American Studies program at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, in the South of the United States. And we had a number of conferences. And one of the conferences we had was entitled The World Crisis and the Middle East. And just to give you a flavor of what we were thinking, I want to read the conference call to this conference, World Crisis and the Middle East, 1975. We call all people who are for human rights, national liberation, and freedom to a conference on the world crisis and the Middle East. Our concern is based on the current exploitation and oppression of the masses of people in the Middle East. We stand totally opposed to the role of imperialism, sub-imperialism, and Zionism in all forms, especially the striving for hegemony by Israel. We believe that countries want independence, nations want liberation, and people want revolution. Therefore, this conference is dedicated to the masses of people in the Middle East, especially the masses of dispossessed people of Palestine. This conference comes near the proletarian holiday May Day. We feel that this is fitting, for May Day symbolizes proletarian internationalism. We call all people who support human rights, national liberation, and freedom to come together at this conference and intensify the fight against exploitation and oppression. Further the struggle through study. Long live the forces of national liberation. Long live proletarian internationalism. Long live Palestine. I think this gives you a flavor of what the most progressive wing of the Black liberation movement was thinking in 1975. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Abdul. That was a great teaser. I'm certain that people would like to hear more and have questions on that. It's a very important moment in our history. Next is Brother Bill Sales, another long-time activist coming out of the Black liberation movement in New York City and Harlem, and also out of the Black Studies programs, as well as the African Liberation Support Committee, Black New York Action Committee, a number of things in his resume, revolutionary organizing. So Brother Bill will be next. Welcome.
Thank you, Sam. Just several things I'd like to do briefly is to preface Malcolm's emergence as an advocate of Black Palestinian solidarity by looking at the antecedents in his life, which put him in the position to play that important catalytic role. August is also the birthday month of Marcus Garvey. Garvey created the largest organization of people of African descent the world has ever seen. He created this organization. It's called the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. He created this in 1914 at the onset of World War I. Garvey, as a very young man, traveled throughout the Caribbean and Central America organizing Black workers. In the first decade of the 20th century also went to London and fell under the influence of Egyptian Sudanese intellectual named Dus Muhammad Ali. Ali was a pan-African and pan-Arab nationalist and a staunch anti-imperialist. He was the founder of the African Times and Orient Review. Garvey apprenticed at that newspaper, producing several articles at the time and absorbing a whole lot of what was to be his later synthesis that Black people should be committed to racial unity on a worldwide basis and to the absolute liberation of Africa from European imperialist control. Dus Muhammad Ali, after his newspaper was banned in England, immigrated to the United States and joined Garvey and became one of the editors of Garvey's newspaper, The Black World. He later on became a fixture in Harlem for many decades, but ultimately spent the rest of his life in Nigeria as an important Pan-African nationalist figure in that country. Now, the Garvey movement made space because of the influence of Dus Muhammad Ali and other people sympathetic to Arab nationalism. It made space in its organization for those African Americans who had rejected a Christian-based identity and thought of themselves as an extension of the Arab world. This was in no way a majority, but their presence in the Garvey movement was to become important. Here we're talking about people like Noble Drew Ali and Elijah Muhammad, who saw their racial identity as much Arabic as African. This has some basis in fact, since so many of the slaves who were brought into the Western Hemisphere were from areas of Africa where Islamic influence was quite important. But in any case, these forces ultimately left the Nation of Islam, organizationally gelled in, left the Garvey movement, and organizationally that movement gelled in the Nation of Islam under the leadership of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And it was that organization which took up the clash between the dominant view among Black intellectuals in the post-World War II, immediate post-World War II years, and a developing appreciation of the fact that we had more in common with what was actually happening on the ground of Palestinians than what was happening on the ground in Palestine in terms of Zionist immigrants. I'd just like to just give you a brief example of this and then talk a little bit about Malcolm and then get out of the way because we'll have time to say some things later on. As early as 1959, the civil rights leadership in the United States among Black people was dominated by people who were thoroughly committed to the Zionist cause. Thurgood Marshall, a civil rights icon, attacked the Nation of Islam in October of 1959 in a speech that he gave at Princeton University. And I'll just quote very briefly what he had to say. He accused the Nation of Islam of being, quote, a bunch of thugs financed by Nasser or some Arab group. Right? The Nation of Islam responded in the press by saying that Marshall's speech was a consequence of Zionist ideology at its ugliest. One of the Nation of Islam's biographers, C. Eric Lincoln, at the same time interviewed Malcolm X, who was then the national spokesman of the Nation of Islam. Remember, this is as early as 1959. Malcolm had this to say, and I quote, "In America, the Jews sapped the very lifeblood of the so-called Negroes to maintain the state of Israel, its armies, and its continued aggression against our brothers in the East. This every black man resents." Malcolm went on to say, "The European and American Christians helped to establish Israel in order to get rid of the Jews so they could take over the businesses as they did the American Japanese during the war. But the American Jews weren't going anywhere. Israel is just an international poorhouse which is maintained by money sucked from the poor suckers in America." End quote. This is Malcolm. He was particularly sensitive to this question of Zionism, not only because of the affinity for the Arab cause that he inherited from the Nation of Islam and from the Garvey movement of his parents, but he had the opportunity to travel to the Middle East in 1959, spend time in the Arab world, including East Jerusalem. It was at that time that Malcolm established direct and lasting contact with Muslim leadership there. From that point to the end of his life, he was to receive Arab activists and Muslim scholars from the East at New York's Mosque No. 7 for the remainder of his sojourn in the Nation of Islam. He returned, of course, to the Arab world in 1964, not only making Hajj, but traveling to Egypt and Gaza, and publicly taking up the cause of Palestinian liberation and anti-imperialist, Israeli imperialist expansion. On that same trip, we should note he spent much time in Tanzania, Ghana, and Egypt with African revolutionaries who helped him develop a deeper briefing on the relationship of Zionism and Western imperial interest. Brother Abdul Kalimat has already mentioned the very famous essay entitled Zionist Logic that Malcolm published in the Egyptian Gazette while still on the continent in 1964. He noted the parallels between the subjugation of Palestinians and Africans. He pointed out the strategic value of Israel to world imperialism. And this he had to say: "The ever-scheming European imperialists wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate and sow the seeds of dissension among African leaders, and also divide the Africans against the Asians." Right? Malcolm had disciples. He had them in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which just a few years after his death was able to advance a pro-Palestinian solidarity position inside of what was now developing as the Black Power movement. It was as a part of that process that I got involved in the African liberation support effort, among other activities. And what I found out was that it was impossible to talk about the apartheid system in South Africa, to talk about the U.S. role in propping up apartheid, without also talking about the extensive involvement of the Zionist state of Israel in the maintenance, not only of apartheid in South Africa, but the whole colonial project on the African continent. Just briefly, let me show you a leaflet from 1976, put out by an organization that I work with, and of course, Brother Sam Anderson, called Blacks in Solidarity with South African Liberation. And in one of our important demonstrations, we noted that the same U.S. corporations which support and maintain the racist and oppressive governments of South Africa and Israel, right? The same corporations were the same ones that were imposing fiscal retrenchment upon the urban areas of the United States. About the same time, I published a pamphlet called Southern Africa, Black America, Same Struggle, Same Fight, in which we outlined the specific involvement of Israel in propping up the South African state in terms of providing nuclear technology to naval ships, providing a way to transship and get around the UN boycott of the apartheid regime, transshipping goods from the US in Israeli tag cargoes through Israel to South Africa, sharing military personnel with South African soldiers fighting in the Middle Eastern wars, and Israeli soldiers providing technical assistance and logistical assistance to the apartheid regime's troops. So throughout the 70s, we found as we built that effort, which ultimately would become successful in helping to overthrow apartheid, we more and more revealed the connection. I could go on to much more, but of course, in the interest of time, there's just one more thing I want to mention before yielding my time at this point. I had moved on in the 90s and in the 2000s to the support work for Cuba. And for many years, I was a member of the board of directors of the Interreligious Foundation on Community Organization, which was the sponsor of the caravans of relief aid that were sent to Cuba and still continue for many years. About 10 years ago now, I think it was 2010, 2011, we became the fiscal sponsor of a British-based organization called Viva Palestina, which raised funds to support a relief flotilla, as some may recall, trying to take aid into Gaza and the occupied areas. Because we became their fiscal sponsor in the United States, that is the Interreligious Foundation and Community Organization, we were subject to a year-long audit by the IRS. We had our tax-exempt status removed, and we were only able, through persistent struggle, to maintain our existence as an organization. So it's very interesting that over the decades of my involvement in the struggle for liberation of Black people, that as time goes on, it becomes manifestly clear that, as we said earlier, Southern Africa, Black America, same struggle, same fight. As we must say today, Black America, Palestine, same struggle, same fight.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Rabab, but just briefly, Rabab had mentioned the 1970 statement in the New York Times that I helped to put together along with a host of other people. William, drawing a blank on his name, Bill. Strickland, right. Wow.
Yeah.
Bill Strickland.
Look, I learned from all of you too. So I'm taking notes.
Drawing a blank. But that statement, in terms of just talking about repercussions, we all talked about the different repercussions if you come out against Zionism. My repercussion was I was teaching at Sarah Lawrence, and my repercussion was the reduction of my stay on the campus from 5 days full time to 1 day, which means that you're fired. Because of the statement that I signed and helped to organize. Sister Rabab.
Actually, we want you to talk more about this later on, because even though we've discussed this many times, we always have different audiences and different people joining us. So this is also the same, that we have to talk more about that. I also have a lot of things to say. So I just want to say a couple of things now, is that one of the reasons we are actually able to have this event today is because the People's Forum has thankfully, and I want to thank specifically Layan Folihan and David Chung and the whole board of the People's Forum, who are giving Ahmed Studies a temporary refuge because of shutdown of our page by Facebook. And we would not have been able to do it had it not been for that. We will be coming back and discussing more what does the silencing mean, and what do we do against it, and how do we understand the whole accusations exceptionalizing Palestine and the accusations of anti-Semitism in order to silence Palestine and disconnect Palestine from other struggles for justice, especially including what we're focusing on Black liberation. But now I'm going to stop and introduce my dear sister and my friend and colleague and also co-conspirator, Dr. Rosemari Mealy, who's an adjunct assistant professor at City College of New York CUNY, which I'm very happy to have been an alum of Hunter College. She's a notably recognized activist for peace, social, and economic justice. Her work involves years of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle and the Cuban Revolution, including living and working in that country. In 2011, Dr. Mealy was awarded the Friendship Medal by the Council of States of the Republic of Cuba. She is the author of numerous publications, including Fidel and Malcolm X, Memories of a Meeting, and she is a member of the board of IFCO, Pastors for Peace, the New York Cuba Sea Coalition, and the National Conference of Black Lawyers. And when we met, Rosemari was also the United Nations representative of the National Alliance of Self-Worth Journalists, I believe, and a reporter at WBI Pacifica. I turn it over to you. There's much more to say, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Rosemari, please.
Thank you very much, Rabab, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to have a few minutes to share some perspectives on Malcolm X's political evolution in relationship to transforming the question of gender. And I'm just kind of linking that to the whole focus of my little piece here on Fidel Castro and the Cuban delegation's arrival in Harlem at the 15th United Nations General Assembly in 1960. But just picking up on Bill and Kalimat, oftentimes when we talk about Malcolm, we leave out the gender issue. And I just want to briefly state that that's something that we should never forget. And I mentioned his transformative evolutions relative to the question of gender, obviously, which we've discussed here this afternoon, beginning with his mother and later his political relationships with active Black women, all of which had an enduring impact on both of his philosophical beliefs and his actions and were essential to his transformation. And this idea is also validated as well when we study his political relationships with leaders on the African continent, the Caribbean, Asia, and Latin America. There's more to that. I did an essay on that, and I'll put it in the chat. There's more to that aspects of that evolution that I would share in an essay that I did a couple of years ago. But let's go back to Malcolm and Fidel and why I have this portion of the presentation. For many of us who've traveled to Cuba, we've also oftentimes been able to meet with the Palestinian delegations. And historically, we've learned that there's been this constant relationship between Cuba and the Palestinian struggles. Oftentimes we meet students who have attended or are attending the medical school in Cuba. We've met delegations of students who are studying farming and just a massive aspect of how the Cuban Revolution solidarity has extended to the Palestinian struggles and the Palestinian peoples. But here's a historical piece that I think is important for us also to link. In September of 1960, when Fidel came to the United Nations for the 15th United Nations General Assembly, and they're subsequently moved to 10 days in Harlem at the Teresa Hotel, that infamous meeting between Fidel and Malcolm rather was not the beginning of the Cuban nation's solidarity between African peoples and the peoples of Cuba. Oftentimes people think that history starts at the moment of learning about one incident, one aspect, one piece of history. But those historical relationships between Cuba, the African Liberation Movement, and in this instance, because we're talking about Malcolm, represented a continuation of more than 100-year history of a solidarity born in the enslavement of African peoples in Cuba and the United States, and the fight against which are central to an understanding of how that those historical relationships have been a continuum. So since the very beginning of the Cuban Revolution, there was open and clear linkage between the Black liberation movement in the United States and the Cuban leadership. So that meeting between Malcolm and Fidel basically solidified those bonds when he met on September 18th, 1960 with Commander Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. And that it was perhaps just symbolic. The symbolism and the importance of that meeting must not be dismissed. The delegation was to stay, as I mentioned earlier, at the Hotel Shelburne. Well, I didn't state that earlier, but initially the delegation was to stay at the Hotel Shelburne, which was on 34th Street in the midtown of Manhattan. So when the delegation refused to accept this exorbitant price that the administration at the Shelburne Hotel offered to the Cubans, Fidel threatened to set up tents on the grounds of the United Nations. So after community folks and progressive organizations heard how the Cubans were being treated, the stay was arranged for them to come to Harlem by one of the Cuban diplomats at the time, a junior diplomat at the time. So the invitation was accepted. And as a sidebar, according to the late civil rights attorney, Conrad Lynn, financial support was acquired from one of Harlem's most notorious bookies, or what we call numbers dealers. His name was Bumpy Johnson. So with the hotel cost taken care of, the delegation's invitation to Harlem was sealed, and they all checked in to the Hotel Teresa on 125th Street. The Cuban leaderships understood very well from the very beginning days, and this was doing in the United States, the Eisenhower administration. The Cubans understood that the Black movement provided a base for the progressive and anti-imperialist forces to neutralize these draconian plans of the intelligence agencies, the CIA, because as a victim of local federal and CIA intelligence himself, Malcolm understood this firsthand. So while the mutual correlation of distrust between the Cubans and Black folk further gave context and rationalization why the Cubans accepted this invitation, and that was another reason for why they moved to Harlem. It would also expose on an international stage the hypocrisy of an American government that professed the sanctity of equality and individual liberties while they simultaneously neglected the civil rights struggles of its own people right here in the United States. To American political elites, so-called Castro's, quote, move was nothing more than a political stunt. Nevertheless, in the context of what appears and what we know as the Cold War bilateralism that existed at the time, this could be interpreted in no other way as a public relations disaster, but it was a public relations disaster for the United States government. So it was just before midnight, and I'll just briefly go through this, when September 19th was the date, when Fidel met with Malcolm upstairs at the hotel, in the hotel. It was just one room. The details of the conversation between the two leaders are chronicled with many interviews in my book, Fidel and Malcolm X, Memories of a Meeting, which I have put the chat and how you can acquire the book. It's in the chat. So this one person interviewed reflected that Malcolm told Fidel, he told him from my interviews with Fidel and also from other representatives who traveled to the United States with Fidel and other folk that I was able to interview in the United States, particularly in Harlem. Malcolm told Fidel, quote, "You have won the struggles for your people in Cuba, and we are still fighting for ours here." And here we could go so far as to imply that Malcolm recognized that Cuba, under the leadership of Fidel, like so many other leaders in developing countries that were following successful liberation struggles at the time, and this one being a struggle of socialism, Malcolm understood that during this meeting, that by these two leaders converging and including the topic of racial discrimination in the United States, U.S.-Cuban relations and Fidel's plan for his speech at the UN, he would incorporate that. And in closing, furthermore, at the time of the meeting, racism and race relations in the United States were at a boiling point, much like we see now, compounded by tense Cold War politics, just like we see now. Fidel's speech at the United Nations and his meeting with Malcolm X thrust what was known as the Black problem in America front and center onto a volatile international political landscape. And that's why we were able to see a few months ago when more than 180 nations came together at the United States demanding that the United States lift its criminal, inhumane embargo against Cuba, with only 2 nations supporting the continuation of the embargo, or what we call the blockade, and those 2 nations were the United States and Israel. So we have a common enemy in a common struggle, but that history of 60 years ago teaches us that coming together in unity, we can only struggle and raise these issues as the Palestinian people are raising, as Black folk in this country are raising, that one struggle, same fight. Thank you so much, because our oppression is ceaseless and we have to take it on, and we have to support socialist construction in Cuba.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sister Rosemary. We will be able to talk more. I'm just really elated. I have so much more to say and add. I do want to echo what you are talking about in terms of Cuban support and solidarity with Palestine. And in this particular instance, I want to mention also Che Guevara's visit to Palestine, as like Malcolm X also went to Gaza and connected and the region and spoke about the struggle with Palestine, and also connected it with the internationalism as well. So this kind of like speaks against exceptionalizing, because it was also against the US intervention in the war of Vietnam. It was in support of liberation movements throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It was in support of people struggling here in, people say, United States, Turtle Island, the Western Hemisphere, i.e. the world that was colonized, part of European settler colonialism after 1492. And so this is really, and there is so much history we can speak about, a lot about it. So we can talk about later on in the program. I wanted to just say, you mentioned Malcolm X and the impact of women on his life. And one of the main impact was Ella Collins, his sister, who actually acted like his mother. And she was one of the signers of the statement that Sam co-edited with Bill Strickland, and many people have signed, and we had all this past year we had multiple events on it. And in that sense also one of the people who are also from the Collins family who just departed is Terry Collins, the amazing leader, Black leader of the Black Student Union and Third World Liberation from Black Panther Party at San Francisco State University. And he had just passed on July 8th this year, which was the same day, the anniversary of the assassination of a well-known Palestinian writer and author and intellectual, Ghassan Kanafani, also at the hand of the Israeli Mossad. So I'm sure we're going to come back to that and talk about what happens to our leaders and how they are constantly, you build movements and constantly movements keep getting attacked. And but I want to next introduce Sister Aisha Aladawiya. Sister Aisha Aladawiya is the founder and president of Women in Islam, Inc., an organization of Muslim women that focuses on human rights and social justice. She represents Muslim women non-governmental organizations at the United Nations Forum, and she coordinates Islamic input for the preservation of Black religious heritage documentation project of the Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture. She organized and participated in multiple conferences on Islam, gender equity, conflict resolution, cross-cultural understanding, and peace building. She's a consultant with multiple interfaith organizations and documentary projects of Muslim American experiences, and who also served on the boards of many organizations in the global Islamic community. And we've asked you specifically in this part to speak about your oral histories, your history, and we really wanted you to address also the archiving of Malcolm X and your role as an archivist at the Schomburg Library. I actually remember going to Schomburg and speaking at Schomburg, not only visiting as a student and as taking my students there, but also I was actually speaking there. Some of it compliments of Sam Anderson, who was organizing the virtual Malcolm X Museum, and some of them were actually moderated by Gil Nobel, and some were through Elombe Brath. So this is a lot of history on that. So please. We're very happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us, Sister Aisha.
Well, assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's an honor, really, to join you. I'm really taken aback seeing faces that I haven't seen
Can you
for
increase your volume?
I don't think I can. It's maximum now. So I hope we can manage this. I'm at maximum.
To the computer, we can hear you better.
Okay, very
Okay,
good.
yeah.
So, so again, I'm happy to see people that I haven't seen for a long time, but I've also worked with some of them over the years. I'm struck by Cinque and how much he looks like his father, Elombe, who really brought Africa to us in Harlem so many years ago. We're grateful for those educational experiences. I actually Sam was sending my emails to an address that I don't access regularly, so I missed my topic. So thank you, Dr. Rabab, for reminding me what I'm talking about. Let me just say, I was born and raised in Alabama. I'm 77 years old, so I grew up as a Christian in the segregated South, uh, segregated and of course unequal, very unequal South. So I already had the experience of what it feels like to be an oppressed person, although unconsciously, but experiencing that on a daily basis. So moving to New York in the early 60s, I encountered Malcolm X, and that was a life altering experience for me. Uh, After embracing Islam in the early 70s, uh, I entered a community that had people coming from all over the world as Muslims, including Palestinians. So I already felt an affinity with the Palestinian people because these were people that I had learned to live in love with as a young Muslim adult. My experience as being conscious of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa kind of was the catalyst for me to really understand what it meant to be a resistance fighter, if you will, against these kinds of forces. And it really brought into sharp review how connected all of these forms of oppression actually are. Um, at the Schomburg Center early on, with Sam Anderson, of course, as one of the founders of the Malcolm X Museum, we did forums at the Schomburg Center twice a year annually for I would say nearly 20 years when didn't miss a beat. And these were all very powerful educational experiences. And I recall two in particular. Rosemari mentioned Malcolm and women, and one of them was titled Women Speak About Malcolm. And on that first one, Rosemary was a panelist to bring into sharp review who Malcolm actually was and what his position was on women. Uh, and more recently, I did another one with the same title with a different group of young Muslim women talking about Malcolm and his impact on them. Actually, it wasn't just Muslim women, it was women. Those are the kinds of um, continuums that helped keep me grounded in the work that I'm very passionate about. I also found it very interesting uh, to note that for someone who's been involved over really several decades of interfaith work, something that I was very passionate about, coming from a Christian family in the South and entering Islam, and now in this interfaith space, I felt I was more than qualified to speak, on this issue of interfaith collaboration, since my family is part of that group as well. Uh, I came to know more recently. Of course, I became a member of the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies early on, and again, I am a believer in traditional Islamic knowledge, and I advocate for that in addition to secular knowledge. So I joined this organization, and what brought my activism in that organization to a head was a statement that was put out by the forum, which is headquartered in Abu Dhabi, a statement that said the board members at our last meeting, at our last board meeting, that we had agreed, I'm paraphrasing now, that we had agreed that it was a good thing for Abu Dhabi to open up diplomatic relations with Israel. And there was no such decision taken at that meeting because I was present, nor was it even discussed at that meeting. My picture was included in that statement that went out broadly. So I felt obviously compelled to withdraw from the organization. And this was something that I treasured, being able to have an international platform to again talk about building relationships across artificial divides. But then that brought me to this conversation about faith washing, which is now what we are calling this. And there are so many other organizations, faith-based faith-based organizations that I've been a part of, that I'm now having to extract myself from, because the recent iteration of Israeli occupation and oppression and genocide against the Palestinian people has come full circle when we asked organizations that were dear to my heart to issue a statement about these atrocities that have uh, protection under international law and so forth. Still, these organizations were only able to regurgitate the statement that, somehow these equal offenses of both sides. This is the usual rhetoric that we're given. I was active around the Bosnian genocide as well, and it was the same kind of language and many of the same people involved in these atrocities. So I'm finding myself now having to move away from uh, many of the organizations, faith based organizations, that I loved for many years uh, because of their inability or unwillingness uh, to state the obvious. So that brings me to a place now where I'm having to reassess those activities because they no longer serve the issue of truth and justice. But again, it's an avenue for people to be manipulated and used against themselves and against what is just and right in the worldview. So that now at the Schomburg Center, many of the programs, as I said, that these were specifically related to Malcolm X, but they covered a broad spectrum of issues, including Cuba. Two of the programs that we did under the auspices of the museum, the Malcolm X Museum, dealt with Malcolm and internationalism. And one particular program invited um, Cuban participation. So we had an ambassador from Cuba to come and talk about the events there and other people in the community, obviously, who are in solidarity with the Cubans and their struggle, continuing struggle. So I'm in a place now where I'm about to retire from the Schomburg Center, and I must say that in all of the institutions that we have, uh, there are challenges when we begin to talk about Islamophobia, about Muslims in general, and of course, the issue of Palestine. It is the red line. So I'm looking for avenues still to continue to talk, to advocate, to speak truth to power in these instances. I'm at a stage in my life where I'm no longer interested, or quite frankly, I don't care about what career repercussions there might be because I'm going to be retiring anytime now. But how do we bring this conversation forward in the face of such enormous resources that are put against us when we try to speak about these issues? And this brings me now to what's happening in Afghanistan, um, where we're going to see the same things play out again. And I would like for us to consider finding ways to make these connections again. I'm coming from Bosnia. Well, first, my own experience as an African in America. Uh, Bosnia, that was my first international foray into genocide. Um, and then we have now Haiti. I'm struck by uh, how little, even on social media, there is about the crises in Haiti. I don't really expect anything from corporate media uh, in that way, but I did think that there would be more um, uh, 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 awareness on social media or even the courage to report on it. But I see all of these issues as so interconnected, and Palestine is certainly not excluded from that list. So there is a letter. Actually, it's a note that I sent to the forum, my letter of resignation from the forum. I will place that in the chat for anyone who would like to see it. I would ask that we try to think about ways to meld all of these atrocities that are happening on a global level. And as Muslims, we are faced with so many different atrocities globally. And here in New York, although we are in the United States, we are impacted heavily by everything that happens around the world. So, and it's the same hand, the puppet's hand, the puppeteer is the same. So let us think about that and how we can bring our intellect, our spirits, our hearts together to fight this monster because it's growing even among our own people, regurgitate the same nonsense that oppressors create for them. And I find this particularly noxious within academia, where so many of our people have just signed off on the dotted line. So I hope that I've made some sense here, but I think that you can understand that I'm really spread out all over the world, the globe, trying to address, these hotspots as they come to us. But my message is that it's all related, and it's not okay to hide that it's somebody else's problem. It's somewhere.
Thank you so much, Sister Aisha. It's very opportune that you've mentioned what's going on in Afghanistan. Actually, it's time for me to plug in that we have an event coming up on September 11th, 2021, on the 20th anniversary, called Whose Narratives? 20 years post 9/11, 2001, and we are looking a critical look on this event and what has happened and why. How is it named? September 11, 2001 took place a few weeks right after the Durban Conference Against Racism, and it also a little bit over a year since the Aqsa Intifada has started, and Israel was wreaking havoc in Palestinian towns, cities, and villages. And the United States presented it as the most important watershed moment in the world. And also, of course, we can see how Islamophobia, Orientalism, and various ways of racism and profiling against Arabs, Muslims, Central South Asians, and all persons of color, indigenous people, have escalated under the excuse of security. So I just want to invite people to attend. We will post a flyer on that, but this is something that's really, really important that hasn't been discussed. I would like, if possible, when we go in the second round, maybe you can speak about how can we also access Schomburg Library resources, and how are we able to find resources on this topic that we're talking about: Black, Palestinian solidarities, the same struggle, same fight, the histories, and so on. Because sometimes it's really, really difficult. I find in my own teaching, when I teach and actually even discussing Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies within the broader academy, within critical race theory, and within ethnic studies, that many people do not know the history of what happened in 1492 with the expulsion of Muslims and Jews and the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula, with the racism that was escalated by Spain and enabled it actually to go and invade and set up settler colonial project in the Western Hemisphere, and also with the rise of Islamophobia, as well as the history of the kidnapping and imprisonment and enslavement of people from Africa, many of whom were Muslims. So that a lot of the stuff is actually not known in the academy. So this is part of the history that we need to kind of explore. So I'm just raising it as something that we might want to think about how do we do that. But I would like to maybe move on to our second round of questions and see what people, and I'll raise the questions and send it over to my brother Sam to figure out how the order of the discussion will be. The questions in the second round. Oh my God, I can't believe it. Hold on a minute. Let me just shut down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One question.
Yeah.
There are three general, four general questions. One is how do we challenge Zionist agenda of attempting to exceptionalize Palestine and place it outside the orbit of the internationalism and constant solidarity of Harlem in particular, and Black liberation in general? That's just one question. How does Black liberation and the struggle against exploitation, colonialism, white supremacy, xenophobia, Islamophobia, sexism and homophobia, ageism, and all forms of injustice connect with Palestine. Third is, how do we respond to the perennial Zionist accusations of anti-Semitism anytime anyone speaks up for justice in or for Palestine? And the last was, what have your personal experiences been with silencing and the cost of your own life when you spoke up for Palestine? So those are broad questions that would probably take a day for each one. For Brother Abdul, Brother Sales, Sister Rosemary, Cinque, Ahmad, those are the questions. I guess we could start with anyone that seems to be burning in you to get out and express and analyze.
I would like to say.
Okay.
I think that question about equating Zionism with when people tell you you're anti-Israel, I mean, they're always going to say that. Anti-Semite. They're always going to say that, and it's said in our generation. It's said in the one before. It's a continuum, as long as Israel has existed. That has been a burning question that people will challenge you on when you're in opposition to Zionism. And I think that it's important to understand what Zionism is, and then you can frame an intelligent argument, that one does not have to, one can support the Palestinian people, or one has the right to criticize Israel for its apartheid positions, its oppression of even its own people internally. So I think that that question is a common sense response. I think, and I'm not being, I'm not trying to say that it's not important, but I'm just letting whoever asked that question that it's nothing new. So other people may want to respond and I'll just answer the other burning question for me, and that was the impact of being supportive of the Palestinian struggle. Bill Sales mentioned how we were in an organization. We were both in an organization, IFCO Pastors for Peace. And Sister Aisha, you will be welcome to join our organization. We're an interdenominational, interfaith organization. We will welcome your participation. We need people like you in there. But personally, from a personal point of view, as a journalist, I've done radio, and Rabab can tell you this. I've had radio shows where people have called, and we have Zoom balls now, where people have called in and attempted to undermine the program. I've had that happen. I have from a personal point of view, being a formerly member of the National Alliance of Third World Journalists, where we've written articles about it and we've been fired. So, it's something that you have to, just like being a member of other organizations, you have an FBI files, and certainly that's going to impact on your employment. But the point is, if you believe in what you're doing, those are kind of like the sacrifices and the choices that you make. And I think each one of us here have been under attack, and we just keep struggling. I mean, it's about principle. You don't give up on your principles. You don't try to water your position down, but you take the information and you use the information as a weapon against these attacks that come at you personally as well as politically.
I wanted to just follow up on what Sister Rosemary was saying, and I wanted to concur with that. Often I carpool to work with people who are not political, right? Or at least not surfacely political or active. They're not affiliated with anything. They're lay people for the most part. And when that question of, and everybody under the question of anti-Semitism sort of came up and was brought up before, and everybody understood that all you have to do is say, I disagree. And these were people from all different walks of life. So it's understood, by people that the way it is handled here as almost as Israel is beyond reproach, and you cannot say anything about them. And I think what's good that is happening because of social media, because of the digitization of things, some of the younger generation is getting that understanding early. You take, for example, the social media former personality Mark Lamont Hill. He lost his position at CNN for being what they considered anti-Semitic, where he did. He had a position against Zionism, and it was consistent with many in our community. He didn't, before it was, he like, I really am not going to really apologize for that sort of thing. What I said in my position with it, this is what it is. And I was surprised to see how many quote unquote celebrities, blue check people, were supportive or like, yeah, no, I agree what you said and what you said. So I believe that we are coming to a time because of social media where people who are quote unquote not political, lay people who don't really understand this chronology, this history that we're talking about, they are beginning to get it. And so that leads me to addressing one of the questions Sam put out earlier about what are some things that we can do. Well, one of the things I think we can do, for example, the Elombe Brath Foundation, we're in the business of digitizing some of these programs from the Patrice Lumumba Coalition held in Harlem for over 30 years, where many times the issue is Palestine. Those sort of things, if they're not digitized, if they're not taken from these tapes and these recordings and they're not digitized, they're lost to a whole new generation. One of the things we're beginning to do is to digitize them. Not only issues of Palestinians, Black liberation movement, fallen freedom fighters, political prisoners, South Africa, Vietnam, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, because when you begin to digitize it, then you can put it online. And once you put it online, young people will find it. These millennials will find it, and they will do things with it that you will not expect them to do with some of these mediums. Yeah, TikTok, Instagram, some of these things will be blocked, but it still will reach some of them, and they will get it. In addition to that, we're working with, I'm on a board of another organization with a lot of people who are experts in this field. It's called UPAMA, right? And we have people like Baruti Bidiako, Melvin Simmons, who's been doing this in public access TV for 40 years, Basim Chowie, Ellen Gary, Bernard White himself, many of them, and that's our goal, to digitize into things. And it's not just Elombe Brath Foundation, Patrice Lumumba, African Kaleidoscope, or BAI. We're talking about, our goal is to digitize, save, and preserve for younger people works of Professor Sales when he was speaking somewhere. If they have it, they have an archive, a trove of information that we've begun to digitize. You know what I mean? We've had 2 programs. We've raised money to digitize those things so that when Sister Rosemari comes and she speaks about Che, Fidel, Malcolm, etc., and people think that no one has that. No, somebody has that. It's just in a format that's not conducive for today's usage. We're going to put it in that format. We're going to make it available so that these younger generations can get to it and use it in their formats, so we can keep a chronology to show the consistency of what we've been saying for decades.
Thank you, brother. I thought it was going to be Ahmad who was going to go next, and then we're actually going to skip the concluding remarks and go into also suggestions, so people can respond to the questions and also say, what do you think? What are some of the suggestions that people can do? Where do we go from here?
Thank you, Dr. Rabab. So I just wanted to touch on the 4th question, which was, the impacts of the advocacy, on our livelihoods, or the costs and experience that we've had. I've had experiences both individually, but also with the organizations that I've been in leadership of. So I, first would like to talk about the Dream Defenders and the Movement for Black Lives policy platform. This platform was issued in 2016, and within this visionary document, they also had, a section that talked about divest and invest. And so divesting from, the military industrial complex and investing in Black communities and investing in resources that communities in America are in need of. And within that section, they talked about supporting BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement of Israel, and labeling Israel an apartheid state that commits genocide against the Palestinian people. Right after that policy platform was released, the Dream Defenders and many other organizations that were under the umbrella of the Movement for Black Lives had events canceled, and also had funding eliminated. And so foundations literally picked up the phone and said, "You've now crossed the line. We're no longer going to be able to fund you." And I think what we saw is from Dream Defenders and many of the other organizations in Movement for Black Lives, a reluctance to change that position. Folks were committed to these positions because of a politic, because of an ideology, because of an opposition to imperialism. And we affirmed that position shortly after we saw some of the responses. More recently, with the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, we just thankfully defeated a lawsuit that was launched against us by the Jewish National Fund and several Israeli Americans, alleging that we provided material support to terrorism because of our support of BDS, because of our support of the Great March of Return, because of our support of Palestinian resistance on the ground. And thankfully, the judge dismissed the lawsuit against us. The opposition asked the judge for reconsideration. The judge rejected the call for reconsideration. And now we expect that the JNF and the parties will file for an appeal. And so that is a battle we'll continue to fight and wage. And we know that we have wonderful lawyers, movement lawyers like the Center for Constitutional Rights, and we think justice is on our side and we will prevail. Personally, we've also dealt with many dynamics. I'm sure just like many other people here, I've dealt with defamation in articles alleging that, I was a quote unquote terrorist. Of course, that I'm an anti-Semite was one of the allegations. This has happened in articles online, on social media, and then on a website called Canary Mission, where the opposition has created profiles for hundreds of Palestinian or pro-Palestine activists to attempt to defame us, and really to attempt to limit the professional activities or the professional advancements of so many young people committed to the cause. What actually caught me by surprise was more recently there was an attempt made to complain to the Florida Bar Association. I'm an attorney in the state of Florida and have license in the state of Florida, and there was a complaint filed with the Florida Bar alleging that I called for the genocide of all Jews. And so they were asking for me to lose my legal license. Thankfully, the Florida Bar quickly researched the matter and found it to be absurd. And so in addition to all those, I faced some surveillance from law enforcement, which again, I think others have as well. So what I'll say just in wrapping up is, these challenges will be consistent. These challenges will be annoying. They will make us uncomfortable, but we have to be resolute in the fact that justice is on our side and that more people are gravitating towards our cause every single day. And so while it seems like at some point the opposition is insurmountable, what we need to recognize is that our will and our passion and our demand for justice is actually what is the most insurmountable. I'll leave it there. Thank you for you all's commitment to this cause, and I appreciate being here with you today.
Thank you. I'd just like to add another layer of the personal experience. In 2018, I was invited to speak in Ramallah, in August of 2018, and I flew into Amman, Jordan, and went to the border between Jordan and Israel, and was detained for over 7 hours and questioned, why, who I am, and and then they finally got the history and so forth and discussion. And it went on and on. And to make a long story short, I was denied entry into Israel to go to Palestine because their new constitution, the then new constitution, said that anybody who smells of BDS, we can always not allow them to come in, which made it more challenging to do my presentation. Fortunately, the hotel where I was staying at in Amman was a young Palestinian manager there, and I told him what my situation was, and he hooked up an internet connection for me to do more or less like a Zoom presentation from my hotel room, and so I was able to get my statement to the conference in that manner. There was I didn't want to go into the details, but it's very, very interesting that the security, the Zionist security, were all people under 40, and they confiscated my bag, and the bag happened to have a few of my Black Holocaust for Beginners books in it, and they looked at it and they were freaked out by by that, and that even made them more crazy to question me and so forth and so on. But that's just one of the most recent run-in with Zionism that I've had, and I'm certain that other people will have. Is there any other person that might want to say something in any one of those three questions? So, Brother Abdul.
Yes, what I'd like to do is to make a few points that helps, particularly the comrades in Palestine, understand the conditions under which we struggle. I want to make 5 points. First point is there's manufactured ignorance about the Palestinian struggle. This is very serious because it really is just part of the general ignorance that the American population and a lot of people in the world don't understand that inside the belly of the beast, we remained ignorant. That's the first point. The second point is that we have a spontaneous movement, Black Lives Matter, other forms of mass response. But what has not happened is that these mass forms of resistance have not sank deep roots in the working class in this country. That's the crisis. We have these sort of flash floods, young people, and so on. Courageous, strong fighters, but not yet turning to the working class, to the hard work of organizing people at the base of the society. Connected to that is the third point, which is the whole question of NGO funding. You know, we come out of the 60s when the movements were self-generated. Today, there's massive funding that's going in to bribe these young people, some people who just joined the movement making $50,000 and $60,000 a year, who themselves call themselves trainers of the people with no back experience. I know the Dream Defenders understands what I'm talking about. In other words, dealing with these funders is a critical moment. We didn't have this as much in the 60s. We've got it now. This is connected to mainstream leadership. The next point, the Congressional Black Caucus, etc. These are all people who are part of the Democratic establishment, even on the progressive wing, in quotes, of the Democratic Party, are tied to the funding and to the political control of these Zionist forces. And really, it's just really, they're really the face of US Capitol. What we're really dealing with here is the strategy of the US Capitol. And Israel and Zionism is really one of their tools in their toolkit for maintaining their control. And of course, the last point I want to mention is the most obvious point, and that is the rising fascist movement that we face. And a part of that is, and this gets to what Aisha was talking about, is right-wing Christian nationalism has become an ally of Israel. And so we've got these evangelical, these big box churches that are replacing the traditional religious denominations. connecting this right wing to Israel. And so these are the forces that we face. But I want to say that there are positive signs. First sign is the survey research says that Black people and young people support socialism in the United States. This is a fundamental shift in general attitude. So we have the opportunity for a new stage of organizing that we haven't really maximized at this point. And remember, the support for Israel, the support for the Palestinian struggle, as we've discovered, the support for the African liberation struggle has to do with, do we build a movement here? That's the critical issue. Do we build a movement here? And the last point, of course, is exactly the point about Palestine, because the survey research indicates young people are more and more in support of the Palestinian struggle. So the future is bright for us, but there's a lot of hard work to be done. I just want to make sure that the comrades in Palestine understand the conditions under which we struggle here in this country.
May I make a couple of points? And very, very briefly, I think, first of all, we don't really have time, but people can check. We've been subjected, myself and also the program, and my students at San Francisco State, we have been subjected again and again. And anybody who's in the academy, and not just on the academy, but also outside, who speaks up around Palestine has been. So I agree with what Brother Abdul said, what Ahmed said, what Cinque, what everybody has said. Rosemari, the experiences of Sam. I actually was going to speak about the experiences of somebody like Fred Dube, who was on the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress in the 80s. And he was fired by Governor Cuomo from New York for ostensibly giving a lecture on political Zionism, but actually Fred Dube was co-organizing with us this big campaign in 1985 called Israel and South Africa, the Apartheid Connection. And it entered the congressional record. So we actually have it from the congressional record. This is when I was working with the Palestine Solidarity Committee at the time. But there has been many more and more and more attacks. And this has to also do with the ways in which the fact that Israel is losing its public relations campaign. Israel historically has assigned its security agencies, its ministries. They even have a whole ministry of strategic affairs. Now they're claiming that it's not active and so on. But the minister is now the UN ambassador of Israel. So it's they're very much concerned about that, because Israel has historically wanted the everybody in the world, but specifically the Palestinians, to acknowledge the legitimacy of Zionism, settler colonial project in Palestine. This is really, it's about it. It's not about the Jews, because there are many Jews, historically more Jews who are anti-Zionist than Jews who are supportive of Zionism, including the theoretical historians and so on and so forth. We don't have time to get into all of this. But now Israel is losing more and more the public relations. And the more Israel is losing the public relations campaign, including in the United States, which Israel believes that it is main arena for support, the more the pro-Israeli forces and the apologists for Israel in the US, very well organized lobby, that's not only the registered lobby, are going to bully, attack, silence, intimidate, punish, and discipline anybody who speaks up, because they have to try to delegitimize not only speaking up for Palestine, they have to send a chilling fear into anybody who might think that they want to speak about Palestine. And they are also very concerned about the fact that more and more and more movements against racism, against white supremacy, against homophobia, against gender repression, against environmental degradation, exploitation, and so on, are aligning themselves more and more and more with Palestine. The more that happens, the more Israel is aligning itself with the right wing, and the more it's enlisting everything it can. And we actually saw an escalation of that during the clearly fascistic rule of Trump. Now we can even talk about what's going on in this country and so on, but we don't have enough time because we're about to finish. But what they actually resorted, they got Trump to pass the so-called anti-Semitism act, which was the main supporters, which is support of what Professor Abdul is talking about, is main supporters, advocates were the right-wing Christian Zionists. the Christian Zionists. They also were the ones who were more advocating for moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They were also the ones who were pushing for Israel, for the U.S. to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and so on and so forth. They were as if they are in rush against time in order for them to get everything else. And this is the biggest issue, is that Zionism is an illegitimate project, it's settler colonialism. And it is, and many people, Jews, non-Jews, blacks, Palestinians, Muslims, Latin people, indigenous people have spoken about this again and again. The last thing I want to say that I think it's really important is that, and you spoke about that, Professor Abdul, is the labor movement, in the sense that now we are actually seeing more changes in the labor movement, because it's been really the hardest nut to crack in terms of Palestine. It's been really difficult. And now more and more labor unions, especially teachers union, especially public school unions. The CUNY, for example, the CUNY Professional Staff Congress has passed several resolutions by now on Palestine. There is more and more of this. So we're going to see more attacks on the US campaign for Palestinian rights, on the legal organizations that support, on the people who speak out. Before we get to the point where we're actually able to breathe, it's going to get harder and harder, because they are in a rush with history for that. So I think organizing, coming together is really important. And this is one of the things why we're doing this. They shut us down with the Facebook page. We go and get hosted on another people's platform. The university cuts down our classes. We teach online. We do this, what we are doing here. So it is a question of how we do it. It is a very big cause. But I think maybe we can, maybe people can also end with saying either adding what people want to say, but also what other things, what can we do next? Because obviously this is not enough. 2 hours is never enough with all this knowledge here.
Do I have time to mention the last story, or is that
Let's
it?
see if Professor Bill Sales and
Okay.
and Sister Aisha need to say something, and then we can come back to you. If that's okay. That's okay, Sam, right? Go ahead.
Well, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I lost connection for some reason there, so I apologize for that. Just briefly, I'm there are so many issues pressing on people in this space, working to bring real change for people's lives and their humanity and their dignity. And so I want to mention Jamil Al-Amin and other political prisoners and what is happening there. So, it is the reality that Black folks tend to show up for everybody's struggle. I mean, that's just what we do, because we know what the experiences are of oppression. So I want to encourage that kind of reciprocity from not only a Palestinian community. And I'm heartened when I see signs from people in Palestine, of all places, showing solidarity with the oppression of people back here in the United States. So I think that if we can, what Malcolm used to say, what he said once was, if you slap someone, it's just, it doesn't really impact, it doesn't have the impact that it needs to address the situation at hand. But he said, if you close the digits, and if you use the same force with your fist, you get a different kind of result. So it's now time for us to close the digits, to just get rid of all of the barricades, the artificial barricades that have been put before us, and that we as a people have bought into on so many levels. So it's also time for us to clean house and recognize the enemy as one. I understand now that Zionists are going into into Africa, in the what place is that? I forget the name of it, but they're everywhere. Now it's like they're on the front lines of humanitarian health cry, all of these things. Let me see. It's just amazing how we are prepared to close our eyes, to atrocities. But we forget that we living in the United States are on occupied land. And so to make sure that we include the Native American experience, because too many of our people don't acknowledge the fact that we are living on occupied land, and the atrocities and the genocide that has happened to Native Americans, not to mention the enslavement of African peoples. I don't think you're going to have to look very far to find too many Black folks who can feel empathy and want to be supportive of the Palestinian struggle for liberation. But again, the mind is a terrible thing to lose or to waste, and to get at the minds of young people, because now we have them. They are in very high places, close to power as they see it, and they are comfortable there with their jobs and their titles and the alphabets behind their names, right? So those are not the ones who are really going to make any kind of risk move, for liberation, not only for themselves, but certainly for other people. So alternative ways of teaching people. That's where I am now, because, there's only so much is going to happen in the university. So it's going to have to be on the ground. And what do we do to take back our children, take back the minds of our children, and to educate ourselves, and then have a strong spiritual foundation to get us through the hard times, because we should expect to be challenged. We will be very naive not to expect to be challenges. So when we hear young people saying, or even old people talking about, these are not our values, these are indeed our values. These are American values. Who was it who said, Rap Brown has said that violence is as American as apple pie, So how do we reach young minds? And I understand that we have students online here, and it'll be up to the teachers, who have their attention to find ways to bring them along, because they're the ones who are going to inherit the struggle after we are gone. And I'm looking at the gray hairs around the room. We don't have time to waste here. So whatever I can do, I'm eager, for guidance, new tools in the box, as we said, because God knows we need them. But I agree that this is our time now. The box has been opened, Pandora, and it's ugly, and it's hard for people to ignore, even if they don't like you. So I think we continue to pry open the box and expose the underbelly of the beast, and then people who are of goodwill, and I think most folks are, that we start to reach out.
Thank you.
So it's wonderful to see everybody. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation.
Right. I think Brother Bill had a couple of things to say. Bill, unmute. You're still muted.
I think we're winning this struggle, and that's why it's become particularly dangerous, because more and more people begin to realize that you can't talk about Black liberation without talking about the liberation of oppressed people wherever they might be found. And therefore, this thing is not going to be resolved simply by a discussion. That is, those who are opposed to us, those who are committed to our continued oppression, have no case when the facts are exposed. And so they claim anti-Semitism, or they try to destroy organizations, or they try to dominate the media so that the debate never takes place. This means that there are hard times ahead, but it means we're also closer to victory than we might think.
Okay.
Cinque has just a short, maybe 1 minute.
I was just going to mention and follow up to Ahmed and others talking about how they've been personally affected. Sometimes it's indirect. Brother Sam Anderson and Brother Bill Sells can attest that they used to have an outlet to speak. I used to be part of a show called The Communicators on 90.3 FM, where I was a co-host. The main host was a brother named Leroy Baylor, who was a neighbor of William Sells and I. And I won't go into the story of the oustering over quote-unquote anti-Semitism. People want to know, they can get the Google Amsterdam News, Leroy Baylor, around 2014. I was sort of out on hiatus at that time dealing with my father's issue. But, you know, that was a great radio program that we had going on. In fact, Brother Leroy had two programs, The Communicators and Respect for Life. And we would always have people on, you know, with these positions. And as I just said, we had Sam Anderson on many times, William Sells. And that format, that outlet was taken away because what really started was a guest named John Comiskey, who is Jewish, said something against Zionism. And they used that to cancel the show. You know, they used it. But what led up to this actually was one single woman living in Harlem who was Jewish was writing in to the show each week, complaining because Brother Leroy, he is Muslim, he is part of the Nation of Islam, he considers himself a Black culturist, and he would always mention by final call by the Amsterdam News Black papers. And she was always writing in to the board at City College, where we broadcast out of, etc., wanting the program canceled because advocating for these Black formats in the final call was mentioned. But when a Jewish guest who came on mentioned something about Israel, they used that as the premise to remove him off the air. You know, so it just goes to show it doesn't have to be someone from outside of the Jewish community. It could be anybody who voices concern over Zionism and what Zionist policy and what they're doing on. So I just wanted to mention that.
Brother Sam, I'm going to turn it over to you to have the last word.
The last word is the first word of the new level of struggle that we all face and must push forward on. I think this session, when our young people begin to look at the whole session, it will be inspirational to move on. And I think the session also will inspire questions from those young folk in the Palestinian diaspora and others, Black folk in the diaspora and whoever else, to give us some questions and comments. I think we look forward to that. I think it's important to see this is not just a mic drop and then we walk away. This is something that we deal with on an ongoing basis. As Brother Abdul laid out, we need to build a struggle, rebuild a struggle inside of the U.S., to rebuild the Black liberation movement, going from just these spontaneous things into something much more organized, institutionalized. And I think that what people heard today will be an inspiration to see that happen.
Thank you all so much. From the bottom of my heart, from our students, from our communities, from everybody who's watching in Palestine and elsewhere, from all our people on various sides of the struggle. But mostly, I would say from me, my students and our program, for all of you to come in and share your knowledge, your wisdom, your critical understanding, and add to so much more in these 2 hours to what we have known before, and expect to be invited again.
And I say Thank you to Sister Rabab for being the political pit bull that she was for the past year around this issue and making it happen. She is a fighter on all levels, and she had to deal with some very serious personal health issues, and at the same time dealing with the onslaught at San Francisco State. And we really appreciate you and your work, your labor. Like I said, you're our Palestinian pit bull, ready to fight at any moment. Yep.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Rabab.
you.
May I say something very briefly? Someone said on my social media recently, talking to women in particular, that self-care is a revolutionary act. And all too often, we who are in the trenches, we that's what we are called to do. We rarely think of ourselves, but it's important to think of ourselves so that we can continue the struggle and pass on what we have to the next generation. So self-care is a revolutionary act, and that's for men and women. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'm deeply honored.